Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Morgan Howard with the Idaho STEM Action Center. I am the communications manager. I am joined here by Christina Sedney and Patrick Lane from the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. And we are here to have a chat about their recent computer science report. Patrick and Christina, could you both introduce yourselves and let us know what your connection is to Idaho and Idaho education?
Sure. I can go first and I'll turn it over to Christina. My name is Patrick Lane. I'm the Vice President for Policy Analysis and Research at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Christina, do you want to go and then we can talk more about WICHE and its connection?
Sure, sounds good. So, hi, Morgan. I'm Christina Sedney, and I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. And we go by WICHE for short, as Pat said, and so you can certainly feel free to use that throughout the conversation.
Yes, that's
And
easier.
yeah, and WICHE has been around. We just had our 70th birthday. So our founding goes back to the early 1950s. And we are what is known as an interstate compact organization. So we are made up of states themselves. And our connection with Idaho goes back to the very beginning. They were one of the first states to sign on to the compact and have been a member since the beginning. And we have, over that time, really enjoyed a very close and collaborative relationship on any number of issues. As part of the compact, each state, through their governor, identifies 3 commissioners. Those are essentially our board members and help direct our work. In Idaho, those members are Matt Freeman, who's the executive director of the State Board of Education, Senator Dave Lent, and President Rick Amon from Eastern Idaho College. And they have been terrific commissioners and a great resource. And so over that shared history, we often are involved in different projects and different work, either directly with Idaho or as part of a network of states working together. And I think as we can dive into the report, this is one of those cases.
Wonderful. Well, how about we just dive in? Let me know who was involved in the creation of this report, and then once we get through that, we'll talk about some of the findings.
Sure, sounds good. So I can talk a little bit about that. So back in 2022, several of the leaders of the industry advisory boards for Idaho's public universities came to the governor and shared some concerns that they were hearing from their colleagues that there just weren't enough graduates coming out of Idaho's public universities in engineering and computer science fields, that they weren't having sort of the pipeline of graduates that they needed for the economy. And they were hearing things from folks and hearing stories and things like that, but there wasn't necessarily a sense of the actual data behind that and really understanding, was there actually a shortage in the supply of these graduates? And so the governor decided to look into that. And so he ended up charging the state board with looking into that, and they ended up contracting with us, with WICHE. As Pat mentioned, we have a long history of working with them to really study that matter. And in particular, the work was really guided by an industry advisory team. So we had a group of folks from different areas of industry, including folks from Micron, from Idaho National Lab, and a number of different engineering and tech firms, the Idaho Technology Council as well, who really helped us guide our work and kind of figure out what were the questions we should ask, who should we talk to, as we were really just trying to figure out, what does the supply of engineering and computer science graduates in Idaho currently look like? Is there a mismatch with employer demand? And what could we do to address that if there was a mismatch? And so that was sort of the impetus for the report. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, Pat.
No, I think you covered it. I think those industry advisory boards, we work across the region, throughout the West, and the ones in Idaho, I think, are as involved and knowledgeable as any that we see around the region. And I think they showed a lot of foresight in raising this as an issue and not just, as can often happen, complaining about it. Their approach was, yes, we see this as an issue, but let's figure out collaboratively what we could do about it. So that was really the impetus for this work. And I think it's led to some very interesting conclusions.
Wonderful. Well, led to some interesting conclusions. What do you guys think were the most interesting findings of this report? Can you speak to that?
Sure. Maybe, Christina, do you want to start off on the sort of demand side, and then we can go back and talk through some of the supply issues?
Sure. And maybe I can just lay out a little bit what we did, because there were sort of a number of different data elements that we used, some of which we sort of relied on publicly available data sources, some we collected ourselves. And so to sort of quantify the supply side, so the number of graduates coming out, we were able to look at a lot of publicly available data, and then also the State Board of Education was able to share some data on Idaho students with us as well. And then on the demand side, so kind of looking at how many folks employers were looking to hire, the Idaho Department of Labor produces occupational projections, so we could look at those in terms of what is the kind of overall projected demand in engineering and in computer science occupations. But we also supplemented that with a lot of employer engagement activities. So we did a survey of employers in Idaho, really kind of focused on the engineering and the tech sectors. We ended up hearing from a little over 70 employers through that. And then we did kind of follow up in-depth interviews with about 20 employers to really, get a deeper understanding of the issues that they were facing on the hiring side, and what they were really looking for and what they might expect to happen over the next decade or so. Um, and so that was sort of they were kind of trying to match up what we were hearing on the demand side from the employers with what we were seeing on the production side from higher education, if that makes sense. And so I would say one of the kind of the top line finding from my perspective is just uh, there is a gap between supply and demand. There's a ton of demand right now. Certainly things are always shifting over time, right? Especially in the tech sector, we see changes in trends related to all kinds of things. Right now, we're hearing a lot about AI, and I will say we conducted this work in the first quarter of 2023, and we weren't hearing as much about it then. So there are a lot of rapid changes, of course. But really, the story that we saw was sort of this really continual rising demand in both of those sectors across Idaho. If you look at data comparing Idaho demand to national demand, Idaho is higher in these fields than nationally. And when we talked directly to employers, we heard the same thing. So many of them were just looking to hire, and they weren't able to fill. And they really liked the quality of the graduates coming out of the Idaho institutions. They were really positive about the folks that are being produced out of the programs in the state. We just heard over and over again that there weren't enough of them, again, both in engineering and in computer science. So I would say that's sort of a really top line finding for me. And maybe I'll turn it over to you, Pat, to share from your perspective what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you've actually read the report and looked at it, there's a lot in there, so it's hard to pick just one. I mean, I think what I was really struck by is that first, there is no single piece of evidence or website that you can go to that shows here's the supply mismatch and here's the demand. So it's piecing all these different things together to sort of tell the most complete and best story that we can. And what I think was evident is that the story from each different piece we looked at is remarkably similar. The employers were sharing that they're having a hard time filling slots they've got now. They're sharing that if they did have more people, they could generate more. If you have more engineers, you can generate more engineering business, and then you need more engineers, and it sort of creates a positive feedback loop. The opposite is obviously true as well. And there were stories from many of them about, for when they work in national companies and organizations, that business is going elsewhere. So that is something that Idaho is missing out on as folks are relocating business elsewhere. And then I think the other consistent piece of the story that we heard over and over again is the value that they see in Idaho graduates. These are folks with roots in the state, likely to stick around. They've done good work, and the institutions are putting out a high quality of graduate was sort of a consistent message across any number of different employers in different areas, but it was consistent really across the board. And I think, we could talk separately about the supply side of the question. And there, again, there's not a single metric coming out that says this is the number of graduates that you're producing, and this is their clear direct path into the workforce. And so it's easy to track. It's again piecing together a bunch of different things. And there, the finding was a little bit more challenging, to be honest, because there are, and this is true really across the country, we're sort of seeing demographic shifts. And this goes back to the Great Recession. Birth rates dropped back then because for whatever reason, birth rates fall follow the economy pretty closely. So people started having fewer children. That translates to 18 years later, fewer high school graduates. And then from there, your pipeline gets thinner and thinner. So Idaho, like many states, is facing a serious demographic challenge where the number of high school graduates projected into the future, which is something that WICHE has tracked and put out for decades at this point, but that number is decreasing. Starting in the middle of the decade. So it's not like you have a new population of high school graduates coming through the pipeline to fill these in-demand jobs. So that's where creativity and thinking more holistically about the pipeline and where students may be falling out of it or not coming into engineering and computer science fields is really crucial.
Yeah, I think I might add to that. One of the important things about this too, kind of maybe in the context of broader trends that we're seeing right now, we're seeing a lot of folks maybe start to question the value of higher education a little bit. Maybe not choosing to go on directly after high school. However, in these particular fields in engineering and computer science specifically, what we heard from employers are the bachelor's degrees are really important. They're looking for a mechanical engineer with a mechanical engineering degree. And so it's not necessarily, and there's obviously a little more flexibility on sort of the IT technology sides. There might be certifications and things like that you can certainly pursue outside of a four-year degree, but we did see a really strong demand for bachelor's degrees specifically from, again, the Idaho employers that we talked to. And so, and then kind of together with that, which makes sense, we see that they're generally generating really good salaries for graduates as well. It's well above the average wage in Idaho on both computing and engineering occupations. And so, there are these good jobs that really contribute to the economy, but they do require, a significant investment in higher education from the student. And as we're seeing, fewer students choose to move through that pathway, that kind of slows down that potential growth. And so that's, I think just a case of kind of these broader national and Idaho specific trends kind of impacting the pipeline as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for walking us through all of that. So with that, I want to see what differences are you guys seeing in the results between the results for computer science and the results for engineering? Like what are the differences there? Can you talk me through that?
Sure. Christina, do you want to start?
I guess maybe one thing I would just say at the start, and this is something we actually grappled with and struggled with a little bit in the report. We've been using the term computer science because that was the term that was originally brought to us. But as we talked with our industry advisory team, we ended up actually kind of expanding that out. So it's not just computer science specifically, but it sounds like a small distinction, but it's actually a big one: computer science and information technology. So that encompasses actually a pretty wide range of degrees. So it's not just somebody who's necessarily going to become a PhD computer scientist, but also somebody who might become a network administrator, an IT support person. There's this like real big range of degree types and jobs within that. And so that kind of by nature also means that the potential jobs they could go into are also really broad and varied. So the relationship between supply and demand on the engineering side is pretty clear, right? Again, you sort of get a specific kind of engineering degree, you get that kind of engineering job. It's generally pretty easy to match up. And on the computer science side, it's a lot more broad. And so again, we're saying computer science, but we're meaning sort of computer related jobs generally. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And so I would say it's just a little bit muddier on the computer side, right? And then another thing to think about there is that so many different industries hire folks in in the IT sector. Everybody needs them, right? In retail, in hospital work, healthcare. Kind of every industry has a need for that, whereas in engineering, a lot of the demand is concentrated in specific fields, so it's a little easier to follow. So I would say kind of broadly speaking, we can make a little stronger conclusions, I think, in some cases on the engineering side than we could on the computer side. So that was maybe a key difference from an overall perspective, but I'll turn it over to Pat maybe to talk a little bit more about the pipeline side of things.
Yeah, I think one of the things we saw, and it's difficult because we essentially looked at 2 points in time, is that the change over time for engineering, again, just two snapshots, so you don't draw definitive conclusions, but there was a slightly downward sloping trend for the number of folks coming into and completing engineering degrees. We saw for computer science a slightly upward sloping trend. Relatively slight differences, but there is something there that I think is worth considering. But I think the conclusions are still consistent across both. That even with that upward trend, you're not going to be producing enough computer science graduates to meet the demand that's there and that would be generated by the feedback loops as well. So, I think even though there's some slight differences within the data, that overall, the story remains fairly consistent across both.
Yeah, and maybe add to that sort of that story. One of those things that we found was really, really important in being successful in either major is math preparation, and having, being able to score well on high school level math tests is a really strong predictor of success in either field. So we saw that as kind of something that stood out. And then in both cases, we also saw there's a gender disparity as well. So for women who tended to score well or at the top level in high school math exams, tended not to choose engineering and computer science at the same rates as male students who scored in the same top percentile on those exams moving forward. So just some things to think about in terms of building out that pipeline over time.
Wonderful. Oh, please, Pat, go ahead.
Sure. Sorry. And I think on
You're
that
good.
last part, we saw it in the data. And then through our conversations with people, including, I remember being at an industry advisory board meeting, and there was a lot of talk about, we have a huge problem. We're not attracting talented female students into the pipeline. And so how can we as an industry sort of take ownership of that and figure out what are some approaches that we can put in place in career mentoring, all those sorts of things, to help address some of those differences.
And I guess maybe one other thing I would share that we thought was interesting in the data, that when students were, initially opting into engineering and computer science and then ultimately choosing a different major, you might think, oh, well, we also have a shortage of healthcare workers. Maybe they're shifting into pre-med or things like that. And it turns out that wasn't largely the case. They were mostly shifting primarily into business and sort of related majors. And so, you're perhaps losing those students to areas that aren't necessarily workforce shortage areas in the same way. So something to watch out for as well there.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about where that shift would be going from one major to the next. But actually, this leads really well into my next question as you guys talk about those disparities and the needs that we have for the future. What do you guys see as the next steps for Idaho Industries and for Idaho education? What do you see the path forward to look like?
Sure. I think the first step is acknowledging and embracing that this is a complex, difficult challenge. There have been other states that have done work on STEM careers and STEM
Pat, you're
workforces.
cutting out.
Oh, shoot. Sorry. Christina, do you want to go and I'll work on my internet?
Sure. Sounds good. So I think maybe I'll try and build on what Pat was saying, but really honestly focusing on the issue. And one of the things, obviously at WICHE, we are big believers in evidence-based policy approaches. And so, really studying the issue we think is a really important first step, and really kind of trying to quantify the question in front of you. And so we think that's wonderful. Also, the work of initiatives like your own and really focusing on STEM is absolutely critical. One of, the big things we found that math preparedness is absolutely key. And so, building that up on the K-12 side is probably one of the most important things that the state can do, and that will have benefits both in terms of computer science and in terms of engineering. And then also one of the things I would mention too is one of the things we weren't able to look at in the data was transfer from community colleges. Just within the data we had, we couldn't do that. But also we know that's a critically important element as well. So thinking both about K-12 math preparation, but also about the math opportunities for folks coming into community colleges or first-year students at the universities, making sure they just have a lot of opportunities to build up that skill set will be really critical in ultimately building the pipeline.
Yeah. And
Pat, you want to try again? Perfect.
yeah. I'll give it a shot, and let me know if it breaks up again.
I'll
I
holler.
think acknowledging and embracing the enormity of the problem. This is not something that is easily fixed. There's not a single policy lever, funding mechanism, anything that you can pull that would say, all right, if we do this, we'll have all the engineers we need in 20 years. It is sort of a comprehensive situation. Other states that have embarked on big STEM initiatives and had great results had the benefit of, as I mentioned earlier, that increasing overall population. So Idaho does not have that. Most states don't have that anymore. So figuring out how you're going to grow this population of students is really key. And there are enough students out there. So I think it's, again, as Christina mentioned, efforts like your own to promote STEM and promote the importance of these degrees, how interesting and exciting they can be for kids. I think that is a crucial step. Heavy industry involvement is, I think, also essential. And I think that goes hand in glove with what you're doing. How can industry themselves help support STEM development, not just how do we take the students who are already interested and already excelling at math and move them a little bit forward, but how do we get some of those other students that may be looking around and may have different interests? How do we get them focused on STEM? How do we get, help develop their math skills? And then also something that we often talk about at WICHE is what about adult learners? There's certainly a large population in Idaho, as there are in other states, who may be working in these industries in some capacity, and with a little bit more education or training in a specific field could sort of advance and fill in some of these gaps in different areas. So it's not a story of there just aren't enough people. It's just that we need to reach and engage a different population than we have previously.
Yeah, and I would maybe echo Pat's point about the employer engagement as just being absolutely critical. And we think there are so many bright examples already from the state. As we were talking to folks, we heard about all kinds of partnerships where different, for example, engineering firms were supplying equipment for labs at institutions so students could train on them and then be ready to go into the field, and offering internships. And we know those work experiences are really, really critical too for kind of keeping students engaged. And maybe a little bit selfishly for Idaho, also showing them the possibilities of being employed in Idaho when they graduate. Another thing you see in the data is that Idaho is sort of regionally situated in a really competitive labor market. So, Washington employs a really large number of engineers and computer science professionals. And we've also seen a lot of increase in the past a decade or so in Utah and in Oregon. They're really building up those workforces as well. So there's a lot of competition for these folks. And so making sure employers are really demonstrating, the great jobs that are available in Idaho for Idaho students. I think, again, we saw a lot of great stuff happening, and just kind of building and expanding that as much as possible will be really important.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Is there anything, we've got a little bit of time left here. Is there anything that you guys haven't had the chance to touch on yet that you would like to say before we wrap up?
I think one thing, and it's a little bit related to the last one, is by no means are we saying that there's nothing going on already. I think there's a lot of efforts and there's a lot of focus on this. What I think one of the sort of top line takeaways from our recommendations is, okay, you have all these things going on. What's coordinating them? How can you coordinate so that they're, again, working complementarily and not duplicating efforts. And everybody's really focused on that bigger goal of how are we going to sort of grow this pipeline so that the state has the engineers, has the computer experts that you need into the future.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Pat. I don't think I have anything to add.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so much for joining me on this Friday afternoon. March being STEM Matters Month, this has been just a really great opportunity to chat with you guys about the future of Idaho and the future of the Idaho workforce and future of Idaho students. So thank you again so much for your time and for your expertise. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.